Hello, students of European history. Today we are going to be talking about the Cold War, and I think that this lecture will remind you quite a bit of the last lecture that we did when we were talking about the end of World War II and the alliances and agreements that were going on at that point in time. We are coming to the point in time when really everything has changed, and Europe is divided into two very different sets of countries. One of the groups or one of the sets of the countries is led by the United States, a non-European country, the US and its allies, and then also on the other side would be the Soviet Union and its client states. And I really do think there's a difference between an ally and a client. The allies are friends with the United States because they want to be. The clients are forced to be allied with the Soviet Union. And although the leadership of those countries are truly dependent on the Soviet Union, I think a lot of the people who live in those countries would rather not be allied with the Soviet Union or would not be a willing client of the Soviet Union. You might remember in the last lecture we talked quite a bit about the meetings that were going on towards the end of the war and the disagreements that were already happening during those meetings. Remember that the Soviet Union had a very different kind of experience than even Western Europe had with Nazi Germany. And so the Soviets really want to have reparations. They want to have control of the nations that invaded them. They wanted to also, of course, spread communism because they believe that this is the best system possible. The United States, on the other hand, really don't necessarily want reparations in the long term. They really want to trade. They wanted to spread democracy, believing that that is the best system of governance. They wanted self-determination for peoples, feeling that the people of Eastern Europe and Europe in general would choose democracy and would choose capitalism if they had a choice. And of course, they want capitalism because those are the kinds of economic systems that the British and the Americans and the French have. And it's almost a necessity that capitalist nations have other capitalist nations to trade with. Both the Soviet Union and the United States wanted to solve the German question, what to do with the Germans. Since their unification in 1871, they had seemed to upset the balance of power and really set themselves on a track to be the next superpower, which gets derailed a couple of different times in World War I and World War II. What to do with the Germans when the Germans seem to be troublemakers. Well, one of the things that both sides agreed upon was the denazification of Germany, or getting rid of all of the Nazis who had been in power, including trials, if you might remember, for the top Nazis or people who had committed war crimes. They also wanted to move the borders. What that was going to actually look like was being debated or was being negotiated at the Yalta Conference and then the Potsdam Conference. And a solution in the end comes up, of course. And both sides agreed that Germany should be neutral, that it shouldn't belong to the sphere of influence, let's say, of the United States or to the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, that it should remain neutral. Once again, there was a conference during the war at Yalta in February of 1945, and then a whole different cast of characters meeting in Potsdam in the summer of 1945. Here's the change and continuity. The continuity here, of course, would be Stalin, and the change then would be instead of Winston Churchill and instead of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, two great statesmen, you have a couple of guys who are relatively new to the scene and maybe not quite as crafty and cunning as Stalin is. You have Clement Attlee representing the United Kingdom or Britain, and then, of course, we have Harry S. Truman as the new U.S. president. Germany was divided into four occupation zones. You can see there is a British zone, there is a French zone, there's an American zone, and there's a Soviet zone. You can also see from this map how parts of what used to be Germany or Prussia were taken by Poland and or the Soviet Union. And then you can also see in the middle of the Soviet zone, there's kind of this four-colored bit, and that would be Berlin. Berlin is also occupied four different zones. There's a French zone, an American zone, and a British zone in Berlin, and then the rest of Berlin is controlled by the Soviet Union. Just a reminder to you, you've written this down, so maybe you just look and kind of nod and know this. But there were the Nuremberg trials, or the war crime trials that were held after the war, and Nazi top leaders and doctors and judges who had been guilty of committing war crimes of various kinds were tried. And once again, this is seen by the Germans as the winner's justice or the victor's justice. What are war crimes anyway? But in the end, I think that most of people in the world can agree that there are some things that are so horrible that they just cannot be done. And so a number of these people were found guilty and were punished appropriately. In the Soviet sphere, of course, the Soviets already are persecuting innocent people and killing innocent people, and so it's no problem for them to get rid of any kind of Nazi or anybody really who is against them taking over their part of Germany and holding on to it. Well, there was a Greek civil war that broke out at even in 1944, even when the war was still going on and when the Germans were ostensibly in control of part of Greece. It's the kind of civil war that we've seen before. It is a civil war between nationalists and communists. So in a sense, it's kind of a mini Cold War, if you want to think about it, with Britain feeling like the Greeks are in their sphere of influence, and the Soviet Union wanting to put Greece in their sphere of influence. So the Soviet Union was supporting communists to some extent, and Britain wanted really to help the nationalist side in this Greek Civil War. Britain, however, is broke. They spent a lot of their treasure on fighting both world wars, and World War II in particular, and Britain cannot help the Greeks at the end of the war. They're barely able oftentimes to feed themselves. And so Britain asks the United States to take over their sphere of influence, so to speak, in Greece. And the United States comes up with a doctrine named after President Truman called the Truman Doctrine, which is passed in 1947, and it gives aid to both Greece and Turkey to keep those two nations free from communism. And the aid is going to be in war material, but then also in money. Now, you might question why give Turkey money when Turkey wasn't in the war, maybe not really completely threatened by communism like Greece is. But Greece and Turkey are basically enemies with one another, and to give Greece something that the Turks were not getting would anger the Turks and maybe put them in the Soviet sphere. And so giving cash and giving war material to both of those nations was designed to halt communism and keep it out of that area. This begins the policy of containment of communism as the official American policy. The Americans could have done nothing at all and allowed communism to kind of run all over the place, or instead of containing it to where it was, the United States also much more aggressive and tried to undo communism in places where it existed. Of course, that was deemed pretty darn dangerous and could have resulted in a third world war. So containment seems to be a logical and safe policy for the United States to exhibit. In the late 1940s, the Allies, that is to say, the Western powers of France and Britain and the United States, were really pretty tired of trying to take care of the Germans and feed the Germans. And this is, of course, their job because there is no German government or anything like that. And so Germany is kind of a welfare case for the Western democracies. And they wanted to get the Germans back on their feet economically. They wanted to give the Germans a currency. They wanted to take the three zones that the United States, Britain, and France controlled, and make them an economic whole and get them back on their feet economically. Well, one of the very easy ways of starting to put together an economy is to create a new currency. The old currency was Nazi currency from a defunct government that doesn't have any value or worth anymore. And so the United States, Britain, and France put together a new currency called the Deutschmark or German mark, and this new currency was very successful in getting the Western Germans back on their feet. This really angered the Soviets because the Soviets wanted to keep Germany as a neutral state. It wanted to not have it as a capitalist state. It seemed like a kind of capitalist invasion of the Western zones of Germany. And the Soviets responded to this new currency by blockading Berlin, or blockading the parts of Berlin controlled by the Americans and French and British. A blockade meant rail and road blockade. It didn't mean air blockade. The Soviets weren't going to be shooting down any American or British planes flying into Berlin. So the Berliners, it's about 2.5 million people in the western sections or the western zones of Berlin. They were kept afloat by what's called the Berlin Airlift. Now, President Truman had a bunch of advisors telling him what to do. Some of them said, just roll into Eastern Germany with tanks and free the roads and the rails from Soviet control. Of course, that would have ended up as World War III. Some of them said that's okay. We have the atomic bomb. This is a much smarter policy. Once again, kind of a containment policy or a safe policy. Seemingly impossible to supply 2.5 million people from the air with everything that they need for as long as they needed it, but this is what happens. The United States and Britain fly in all of the supplies, the food, the coal, and everything else that the people of Western Berlin need. And after a number of months of doing this successfully, about 9 months, the Soviets gave up and opened up the roads and rails. They were kind of being embarrassed by the successful nature of this airlift. So the Soviets end their blockade. Road and rail traffic can happen once again through the Soviet zone. But really what we see happening around this period of time is the creation of two Germanys, that everyone starts to realize that there's going to be a Western democratic and capitalist Germany and an Eastern dictatorial and planned economy or communist Germany under the control of the Soviet Union. This just happens. It isn't really what's supposed to happen according to the agreements at the end of the war, but it just does. In fact, what happens is an iron curtain is developing between the Western capitalist democracies and the Eastern planned economy dictatorships. And you can see that on the map here quite clearly. The blue would be the Western Alliance, and the red would be the Communist or the Eastern Alliance. And there is an iron curtain, according to Winston Churchill, who gives a great speech about this in the 1940s. An iron curtain that is descending between the Baltic Sea and then going all the way down to the Adriatic. And this, once again, is just the dual nature of the world at this point in time. There are a number of neutral states as well, but we don't need to really concern ourselves too much about them. Well, both of these blocks, or both of these different kinds of alliances, had their economic and military unities or alliances or plans that they put into effect. The United States had a really generous but also a very self-serving economic plan called the Marshall Plan. This starts in 1947 and runs into 1951. And it's $12 billion worth of economic aid to any nation in Europe that agrees to follow some rules and ask for this money. The reason behind it, of course, as I say, is somewhat self-serving. It is designed to get these European states back on their feet so that they can trade with the United States and with one another and spread capitalism from each and every one of those European states, build a market for American goods and so on. And it's really quite successful. If the states are given money in order to rebuild, much of the material that they are going to start to rebuild with, of course, is going to come from the United States. The Soviet Union had a kind of mirror image plan or organization for putting the economies of their client states into a kind of communist or planned system. It was called Comecon. I know it sounds like a comic book convention, but it actually stands for the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Now, this is a little bit different, I think, because once again, capitalism is based on supply and demand and freedom and things like that. This is a more sort of planned kind of economic system where the Eastern European economies become dependent on the Soviet Union, once again in kind of a client state sort of relationship where they are trading with one another, but they have to trade with one another, and it's all planned out by the governments rather than just by the invisible hand. In terms of military unity, the United States created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. It's the United States and Western Europe and Canada. And the reason, or the reason for being behind this, is the idea that any individual state might be able to be turned communist, or might be able to be taken over by the Soviet Union alone. For example, Denmark might be in some way brought into the Soviet sphere with pressure and so on. But what NATO decided was that any member state is like any other member state, and so an attack on any one of the states is an attack on all of the states, and they all must respond immediately to any kind of aggression against one of those states. Great idea. There is also a little bit later a Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviets' idea of a kind of military alliance, and this too is an agreement for these states to defend each other if there was an attack by the West. But the difference is they are forced to be in this, whereas NATO is a voluntary kind of thing. And then also those Warsaw Pact states, as we will see over time, tend to invade one another when those states are trying to break out of or break away from communism. So once again, it's a kind of client relationship with the Soviet Union rather than a free relationship with a different country. Here, once again, you can see the Warsaw Pact countries and the NATO countries, and it really has to do a heck of a lot with the Iron Curtain, and then, of course, those neutral states are neutral. Well, nuclear weapons are what ended World War II. We didn't really talk about that. We didn't really talk about the War of the Pacific. You'll be able to do that when you take American history. There is a monopoly on the atomic bomb that the United States had from 1945 all the way up into 1949. And so the United States really is a superpower plus at this point in time, having that awesome and terrible weapon. The Soviets are able to research and steal their way or spy their way into getting an atomic bomb in 1949, and then there is there is atomic parity at that point in time, or at least both states have atomic weapons. A few years later, the United States creates a hydrogen bomb, which is hundreds, if not thousands, of times more powerful than what the United States dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The Soviets get likewise a hydrogen bomb in 1953. And then we have a very dangerous situation. Hydrogen bombs are so powerful that a number of them can destroy all life on the planet. Therefore, what happened was something called MAD, or mutually assured destruction. That means that if the United States attempted to launch an attack on the Soviet Union, or if the Soviet Union tried to launch an attack on the United States, that it would be unsuccessful. Each side would see the other side coming and launch their nuclear weapons or have a nuclear attack against the other state. In the end, all life on the planet would be extinguished. Mad. So the good news with that, even though it's a very scary situation, is that the United States and the Soviet Union avoid going to war with each other throughout the Cold War. There is, however, an arms race nonetheless. There's an arms race with conventional arms, with regular kinds of weapons, tanks and planes and submarines and so on. But there's also an arms race in nuclear weapons. And so the United States and the Soviet Union also have more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many hundreds of times over. I suppose in some respects they are worried that some of their weapons could be knocked out by a sneak attack. But in the end, like I said, MAD says that both nations, in fact all life on the planet, would be extinguished. While the United States is first to get nuclear weapons, and then it's the Soviet Union, there is a kind of nuclear club that is established, and France and Britain and China and India and then a whole bunch of other countries, some who admit it, some who don't, have been able to join this nuclear club and have nuclear weapons. The delivery mechanisms for these nuclear weapons at first are bombers, big heavy bombers that would drop nuclear bombs on a city if they had to. And then as technology improves over time, there were rockets or intercontinental ballistic missiles that were able to deliver a nuclear warhead or up to, let's say, 10 nuclear warheads at different points in time. There were also submarine-launched rockets that were developed, and then there were also cruise missiles, which were developed, which are kind of like um, smart rockets that fly very close to the ground instead of being launched up through the atmosphere and back down like an ICBM. In the end, there are multiple ways of having nuclear weapons delivered, and it would really be mad. It would really be impossible for any state to try to defend itself against a nuclear attack, other than just nuking the other guy. Since the United States and the Soviet Union can't fight with nuclear weapons, since they can't fight with conventional weapons, because conventional weapons would oftentimes, if you think about it, could oftentimes lead to a nuclear exchange, there are all kinds of smaller regional fights that happen that are conflicts between the Soviet Union and the United States, but done through different states. For example, the Chinese Civil War. The United States is in the Korean War. Let me go back for a second. The Chinese Civil War is a conflict between nationalists and communists in China, and of course the Soviet Union support the communists, and the United States support the nationalists. Or in Korea, for example, same kind of thing. Soviet Union supporting the North, United States supporting the South. Same thing in Vietnam. In the Middle East, generally there is an Arab-Israeli conflict, with the Arabs being supported by the Soviet Union and the Israelis being supported by the United States. In Africa and Central America, there were also a number of smaller conflicts, many of which derived from decolonization. In other words, the British or the French or the Portuguese or the Belgians leave, and then these countries are kind of up for grabs. Are they going to go communist? Are they going to go capitalist? And the United States and the Soviet Union both pour arms into those nations to try to influence which direction they're going to go. Happily, in the 1970s, there was a bit of an easing of tensions called détente. Both sides realized in the 1970s, as their economies start to sour a little bit, that too much money was being spent on the arms race. It was perhaps unnecessary. The Vietnam War was over, and so the Soviet Union wasn't providing weapons to kill American soldiers with. The relations between China and the Soviet Union at that point in time started to kind of sour or go bad for various reasons. And so détente was the United States and the Soviet Union coming closer together and being a little bit friendlier and trying to reduce, at the very least, reduce nuclear forces. And there was an agreement called the SALT Agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, that did indeed reduce the number of nuclear forces that both of these countries had. You can see President Richard Nixon with the premier of the Soviet Union, a guy by the name of Leonid Brezhnev, talking at this point in time. You can also see that some people really didn't like this very much, that they considered it kind of a sellout to communism, but in the end, the 1970s are dominated by a slightly friendlier attitude between the Soviet Union and the United States. After World War II, there was, like after World War I, the formation of an international body that was supposed to ensure peace and supposed to ensure security for member states. The idea was that the United Nations would be a forum for negotiation rather than conflict. And once again, there are 5 permanent members: the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France, and China, all having a veto. Kind of talked about this in the last one too. All these countries around the world represented in the General Assembly. And the Cold War is being fought through the Security Council, with the United States and the Soviet Union on opposite sides. And then you can imagine Britain and France usually supporting the United States. Oftentimes, in a conflict around the world, peacekeepers are sent. These are soldiers with blue helmets who try to keep peace. It's kind of odd to think that soldiers are there to keep the peace when it comes down to it, if people want to kill other people, it's really hard for soldiers to or peacekeepers to stand in the way. And so it's more of a threat, really, and not always successful to have peacekeepers show up in a conflict. But we'll talk a little bit about that, at least when we talk about Yugoslavia. So once again, just to summarize for today, Europe at the end of World War II and for a very long period of time is divided into two hostile camps. And if these two hostile camps would go to war, it really meant possibly the end of humankind itself because of mutually assured destruction. And this is a very different kind of post-World War II Europe, that you have individual states really giving up a lot of their independence, or really giving up a lot of the competition between them in order to belong to one bloc or the other. And then those two blocs are really what are competing with each other and controlled by superpowers that are questionably European. Even the Soviet Union, questionably a European state. The United States, definitely not a European state, but definitely a capitalist democracy. No longer after World War II do we have European countries leading the world. We have, as I said, the United States or the Soviet Union, or at least blocks of nations that could possibly be leading the world. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture. I encourage you to do the reading on it, and then also the reading quiz that goes along with it. Have a great day.